Thank you for joining us on France 24 for our special coverage of Lebanon's first parliamentary elections in almost a decade. My name is Nadia Shabi, and with me in the studio is our guest, Lebanese activist Ramez Abid. Hello. As well as France 24's Mariam Sab, who'll be helping us to analyse the many issues at play in this poll. Also, throughout this one-hour edition, and as vote counting gets underway across Lebanon, we'll be crossing live to Beirut, where Sanam Chantier is standing by with her guests. And before we do that, let us take a quick look at the day's polling.
Lebanese voters were up bright and early for a vote they've been waiting nearly a decade for. The mood was tense and security high to ensure everything went smoothly. These are the first parliamentary elections since war broke out in neighboring Syria in 2011. Some Lebanese say it's high time for change.
We want to change and reform this country because we're fed up. It's in fact a celebration of democracy.
Many hope new contenders from civil society groups can challenge the decades-old sectarian political system. But for that, they need a high turnout, higher than the 55% seen at the last vote in 2009. Some voters had to travel long distances to cast their ballots. Lebanese law dictates they must vote in the district their ancestors came from, not the one they currently live in.
I traveled from Beirut and left home at 5:30 a.m. to come and vote. We've been waiting for the election for 9 years.
Voters will choose from more than 580 candidates to fill a 128-seat parliament, divided equally between Muslims and Christians. The main race is between a Western-backed coalition headed by current Prime Minister Saad Hariri and the Iranian-backed Hezbollah group. President Michel Aoun said the Lebanese had a divine obligation to vote. His Free Patriotic Movement, a close ally of Hezbollah, currently has the second-largest bloc in parliament.
Well, for the very latest, let's go straight to Beirut, and Sanam Chantier joins us from a polling station in the Christian area of Ashrafiyeh. Sanam, hello, thank you for being with us. Voting booths closed just over an hour ago. How did polling go?
Good evening there to you, Nadia, indeed. And the latest figure that I have at the moment for voter turnout stands at 46.88%. And indeed, the atmosphere around us has been extremely festive, people beeping their car horns. They've had music along the streets of Beirut. However, on the whole, there's been a great deal of disappointment. Observers are saying that the authorities had just under a decade, Nadia, that's 9 years, to organize this election, and yet there were many issues. Firstly, women were largely underrepresented. Some of the women were slammed because the Lebanese believe that politics are a place for corruption and aggression, and it wasn't for them. Initially, there was excitement around the youth vote. Of course, there are a large number of first-time voters, over 500,000 of them, but they too were suffering from voter fatigue. Now, this time round, there were a large number of independent players who are being referred to as external candidates. They tend to distance themselves from the traditional political alliances in this country. However, many people decided not to actually go to the ballot boxes because they felt with the small numbers that were going to enter parliament, perhaps 2, 3 or 4 of them, they weren't really able to make any real difference to the country's political landscape. There were also some reports of violence in areas dominated by the Druze. Now, one man who's been actually observing the elections today joins us here. His name is Ammar Aboud. Thank you very much for joining us. You're, of course, the co-founder of the Lebanese Association for Democratic Elections, and you're an independent observer. What is your assessment, Ammar Aboud, of today's vote?
It is a disappointment, but unlike political parties, I don't care about the political results. I'm thinking about the process. The process is a regression if we compare it to previous elections. The turnout is lower. Voters' apathy is more apparent. The rare reformist changes that occurred in this new electoral law, which is the pre-printed ballot. We were the last country in the world without a pre-printed ballot. Ensured the secrecy of vote, which in turn made the major political party crazy, since they cannot buy efficiently votes anymore.
Just to interrupt you there, does that mean that there wasn't any evidence of voter fraud this time?
On the contrary, now they used a loophole in the law where a handicapped person, let's say a blind person, could ask somebody to help him vote. They transformed the majority of voters into handicapped people in order to secure that they were brought in with party agents, and party agents actually voted in their stead. Hence, more apparent a fraud and that. But that it became such a norm that not one of the single major parties did not do it in his stronghold, and where he felt afraid. It's an indication, one, that previously the fraud passed by the fact that there was no pre-printed ballot, and secondly, that all major political parties have an erosion of their political base. They were afraid. They could not mobilize people as they did 13 years ago.
Interesting, a very different perspective to what we heard from the European Union observers. Now I have a question for you, and this is something that's been on everyone's lips. From what you've observed, were there any complications surrounding this new law that was introduced last summer? Because I heard from a number of voters that they themselves were confused because of the unlikely allegiances.
Yes, it is a problem because it's a bit complicated and different, and there was no voter education. It is a monster rather than an electoral law, to the point that a colleague of mine, who is a French electoral expert, could not understand the law because he was using logic. You cannot use logic and understand a Lebanese electoral law. You have to understand the Lebanese political way to know why and how they reached such a law. The problem is there are too many variables. The political parties seized even the pretense of a political position. It's alliances à la carte, depending on the region. So voters do not know they're with whom and against whom. And they could not do the same thing as political parties, like in the old days with the panachage system, putting their eggs in different baskets. They now have to choose somebody, and they're afraid of that.
So there is fear amongst the voters, and I have one last question for you. Do you think that this country is now years or even decades away from what could be a semblance of what's seen in the international community in their eyes and by the West as a democratic process?
I don't much care about the Western eyes. By my eyes, it's far from a democratic society. And I doubt that Western states are interested presently in how much democratic the system now. I think their narrative is, at least it's a stable country compared to the surrounding. Let's keep it this way, irrespective about democratic rights of its citizens.
Amar Aboud, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Nadia, back to you in the studio in Paris.
Sanem Chantier, thank you, and thank you to your guest, Amar Aboud. Well, let me turn to you now, Ramez Abid. You're a student at Paris's Political Science School and a Lebanese activist who's voted for the first time with this election. What was it you wanted to see this poll achieve?
Well, I think, first of all, we're at a generational crossroads in Lebanon currently. I think this election is decisive for Lebanon's contemporary history because for multiple factors. First of all, for the first time, you have people like me, which is a fifth of the electoral base, that are voting for the first time. And most of them have actually left the country because of a lack of opportunities, because of corruption, because of a political system that disenfranchises and disillusions the youth. So what we were looking at from a social society perspective was to build on the momentum that we've been having over the past few years. If you want to understand how the civil society has organized itself for this election, you have to go back to 2015, to the waste crisis that we had, to the massive protests that we had, which was the largest civil protest in Lebanon since the protests against the Syrian occupation, which led on to the municipal elections in 2016, where the civil society group got 40% of results in Beirut. And this is why, for the first time in Lebanon's history, we have a civil society list running across all of the circumscriptions. And the idea today is that we want to bring back politics to the society. We need to go back to actually bringing people, giving back hope about what it means to be engaged in politics, and that actually people need to have a sense that their actions, their votes, may have an influence on the system.
So given all that, given this new opportunity, what do you make of this low turnout, 46.88%, that's lower than the previous election? What are you concerned about how that might translate for these new faces?
Well, of course. I mean, if you look at how the society is perceiving politics, it was mentioned earlier, there is disillusionment. Today, because of the entrenchment of the clientelism that's present, because of the embeddedness of a status quo, people feel as though their voices are not going to be accounted for. People are scared of giving their votes to new figures. It's better the level that you know. So the question is today, there's been a massive campaign and a fantastic campaign that's been done on the ground by multiple civil society groups. I'm thinking about Kuluna Watani, Libadadi. They have been going on town halls, meeting citizens, having programs. Just the fact of talking about programs in the Lebanese election is a milestone. And because of this, you are noticing that the incumbents are reacting, and for the first time, they are actually proposing programs themselves. So we're moving beyond the whole vote for me, I'm going to give a populist speech, and because of my sectarian and feudal allegiances, you're going to vote for me. Today, it's actually okay, it's very superficial, but we have a concrete program to make the economy, the political system, much better for everyone else.
Now, as we were hearing from that observer there, Mariam, this poll in itself has been flawed, as he described it, and it's been 9 years in the making, with repeated postponements because of security concerns, most importantly because of what's going on in Syria and nearby. Tell us more about the complex backdrop to this election.
So the Lebanese political system, Nadia, juggles 18 officially represented sectarian groups, and it's hard to keep all those balls in the air. A testament to that is the fumbling and paralysis of the last 9 years, where they've dropped more than a few. The government collapsed twice since then. The parliament extended its mandate several times. The presidency vacant for 29 months. So what's complicating matters, as you mentioned, Lebanon now has the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. Since the last election, Lebanon has seen more than 1 million refugees stream over the border from Syria, putting an enormous strain on infrastructure, on the economy, on the delicate sectarian balance in the country. And on top of that, Lebanon is known to be something of a proxy battleground. Primarily, we're talking about Sunni Saudi Arabia, Shia Iran. All eyes on this election will be on the performance of Hezbollah, the country's largest Shia political party and paramilitary force, backed by Iran and a key player in the Syrian civil war since its offset. Now, also Prime Minister Saad Hariri and his Future movement, who are backed by Saudi Arabia, had the largest alliance in parliament. He was widely believed to have been coerced by Saudi Arabia to announce his resignation late last year, which sent huge ripples throughout the system in Lebanon. And that was in order to try to force Hezbollah's hand and curb Iran's influence there. Now, it didn't go as planned. Of course, as we all know, Hariri returned to Lebanon, retracted that resignation, and continued to lead the unity government, which Hezbollah is a part of. Some other things that have happened in the last 9 years, and even prior to then, crisis in public services, of course, which you mentioned, Rami, is why many Lebanese people have to leave and go abroad for opportunities, electricity lacking, healthcare, education for all, high unemployment, widespread corruption, nepotism. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And after all this, many want change. Many are sceptical that it can come about. In this campaign, we're seeing some candidates calling for some forward-thinking things, well, not by other standards, but in Lebanon, the abolition of a law, for example, forbidding sexual intercourse contrary to the order of nature, which has been used to prosecute gay men. They also want to see that child marriage is abolished. They want equality for women, an emphasis on human rights, secular laws, including civil marriage, because as it stands right now, another reason why many Lebanese have to leave, a man and a woman of two different religions cannot marry in Lebanon. They have to go abroad to officiate that. So the list goes on and on. And if we had a few hours, we could go over some of the challenges, but that's all led to this massive delay and some of the complications around this election.
And added to that, Lebanon is technically a parliamentary democracy, but it's organised around a decades-old sectarian-based power-sharing system around those 18 sects, official sects that you mentioned there. Tell us about that.
Well, the new electoral law, within that, the sectarian allocation of the 128 member parliament stays. We've got 64 seats for Christians, various dominations, of course, and 64 for Muslims, Sunni, Shia, Druze, Alawites as well. It's been at the centre of Lebanese politics for decades, this confessional system, and it was based on the 1932 census data, which showed that Maronite Christians have a substantial majority of the population. And so, in turn, the president of Lebanon, who's elected by the parliament for a 6-year term, must be a Maronite Christian. The Speaker of Parliament, a Shia Muslim, and the Prime Minister, a Sunni Muslim. But that census is decades old, and they don't want to do a new one to see what might have changed.
Well, adding to all of that, we also have a new electoral reform. Now, it's taken years of various lawmakers haggling over this reform, passing a new law last summer to replace the one that was in place since 1960. And the new system is complex, to say the least. Let's take a look.
Lebanon's going back to the polls for an election delayed by 5 years. And almost in honour of the occasion, it's got itself a new electoral law over proportional voting. The Lebanese won't just pick a list. They can choose their candidate preference for their own region too.
The number of seats allocated to each list will be determined by the electoral score obtained by that list. The number of winning candidates will then be determined by preferential vote.
Confused? Not to worry, you're in good company. Despite an information campaign from Lebanon's Interior Ministry, voters are unimpressed.
I didn't understand anything from the new electoral law, but I'm committed to my political party.
It's very complicated. Voting is a religious duty, and everyone who is able to vote must do so.
I got part of it, but not the rest.
I don't know if I'll vote, because nothing will change.
That kind of disillusion may just play into another aspect of Lebanon's ballot, abstention. During the last parliamentary elections in 2009, only half of all voters bothered to turn out.
So, Marianne, what can we make of this new electoral system? Is it going to be a success? Is the outcome of this vote going to be the proof in the pudding?
Well, supporters of the new system say that it will improve representation and hope that it might be a baby step on the path to coexistence in a region really splitting at its sectarian seams, while others fear that it's actually going to make it hard for newcomers running secular campaigns to compete with the incumbent candidates who have deep established roots in their communities. Many have dug their heels in on the back of a long accepted tradition of dynastic politics, which we see in Lebanon. Another factor keeping the big guys in seats is that in Lebanon, patronage often trumps policy. It's about what can they do for me and the people who think like me, the people who pray like me, as opposed to what can they do for a united country, for Lebanon as a whole. Now, critics also point out that the new law, which redraws the electoral districts, that does so in an overly sectarian way, so emphasising these differences and divisions. But it also paves the way for a record number of new candidates, as Ramiz was talking about, among them women, civil society groups that could chip away at the old guard a little bit, although we don't expect too much to change. We've got an alliance of 11 civil society groups across different ages and religious sects, which called the National Coalition, and they aim to create a new political class. And also, for the first time with this new law, Lebanese diaspora are allowed to vote for the first time from abroad and weigh in on this election.
And we'll go into that a little more later. Let me just ask you quickly, Ramez. Much has been said about the fact that politicians in Lebanon pay for airtime during the campaign. How has that translated for independents who don't necessarily have the same means as those dynasties we were talking about?
I mean, going beyond as well, paying for airtime, to actually register as a candidate in Lebanon, you have to have a certain amount of money in the bank account to be registered officially as a candidate. So today, we do know that there are multiple factors and obstacles that are in place to stop any potential challengers to the incumbents. This law is one of the key reasons why you also have had more difficulty in actually forming civil society unions. But at the same time, if this law took multiple years to make, it's for the reason why it actually suits the benefits of all these elite parties. So at the same time, we do feel as though there are obstacles in place, but because of social media, and this is the first election in the social media age, we've actually have been seeing alternative ways for these new parties to actually present their programs. And I think this is one of the reasons why we will hope for these historical results tonight.
Okay, well, I think we can cross back now to Sanam Chantier, who's in Beirut, and she's joined this time by her guest, Shibli Malat. Sanam?
Indeed, I'm joined right now by Shibli Mala. He's a law professor and also a former presidential candidate. Thank you very much for joining us on this special edition out of Beirut. Sir, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Now, I'm hearing from observers and voters today that the sectarianism system here in Lebanon is very much deeply entrenched. And as a result of this, we're not really going to see a sea of change in the country's political climate, even though this new law has been introduced. What are your thoughts?
Well, the most important dimension of the law is that it remains sectarian. To that extent, we are stuck in a system which is medieval for some and very complicated to allow someone to run with a majority. So we're not expecting a major change at all. Also constitutionally, the most important consequence of any election is what is the executive afterwards. And we essentially know what the executive is going to look like after the election.
Now, that takes me to the next question. So we presume that there won't be any surprising results in these elections. They will form another coalition government. What next?
Well, the most important constitutional positions in the country are the presidency of the Council of Ministers and the presidency of Parliament. Now, two of these three won't change because constitutionally they don't change. So the only thing that might change is the Prime Minister, the President of the Council of Ministers. Will it be Hariri or not? This might be the only change that comes from this election. So watch that space, whether Mr. Hariri remains Prime Minister or if he loses big, he gets replaced by someone else.
Now, I've been speaking to a number of voters today, and they're all saying to me, Mr. Malad, Professor, that people don't believe that this is a democratic process. They believe that will come when people are elected on merit, not because of who they're connected to and the name they carry. When the candidates lists are more coherently put together, of course, there were confusions around this one. And when people can vote where they live, not necessarily where they were born, are we decades and decades away from a system like that?
Well, let's start with the positive. It is a relatively free election in Lebanon. We've had problems with one of the anti-Hezbollah candidates being beaten up in the south last week. But overall, it's good that you have elections. The negative, of course, is very heavy. As you say, Ms. Chantier, it's a system that is unable to deliver for two main reasons. One, because it's sectarian. And so what we see is this are the sons of previous MPs stepping in. And that obviously cannot bring real change. And the other dimension is money. The amount of money that is put in this election, although the law is supposed to control it, it doesn't. So eventually the people who have the money are going to be the ones who get elected.
Professor Malad, we've been speaking about the more domestic situation, but when talking about Lebanon, it's impossible to ignore its regional standing. Of course, it's a battleground for Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. In your opinion, has there been any foreign interference in these polls?
Well, it's watched carefully, and the greatest fear that many Lebanese have, and of course the powers that support them, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United States, is a victory for Hezbollah. And so to that extent, the most important dimension of the elections beyond the domestic is whether Lebanon, in its fragile non-alignment position vis-à-vis Iran and Saudi Arabia, is going to lose it to the benefit of Iran.
And of course, we had one example. There were reports that in Baalbek, indeed, where Hezbollah was facing opposition, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, went and they managed to pray in the mosque with those that were on the opposition lists, in a way declaring their allegiance.
Yeah. It's pretty shameless, unfortunately, in Lebanon. As you know, our Prime Minister was essentially hijacked in Saudi Arabia a few months ago. Similarly, only yesterday, Mr. Nasrallah expressed officially again in an interview that he believes in the leadership of Iran. It's a bit odd. You have to get used to it. It's quite humiliating for nationalists in Lebanon, but that's the deal that we have. The most important dimension is to keep the stability in the face of the horrors that are happening in Israel, Palestine, in Syria, and on the Iranian-Saudi front.
Shibli Mala, Professor of Law and former presidential candidate, thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24.
Thank you, ma'am.
Back to you, Nadia.
Sanam, thank you very much for that. We'll, of course, cross back to you a little later in this special edition. Now, let me turn to you, Mariam. As we heard, this election has been touted as a test for the Western-backed Sunni Premier Saad Hariri and his Iran-backed Shiite opponent Hezbollah. What can we expect from the outcome of this poll?
All right, let's talk about possible outcomes for, as you've mentioned, Nadia, the political blocs. March 14th, the largest alliance in Parliament led by Saad Hariri's pro-Saudi Arabian Future movement. It's expected to lose seats to March 8 bloc dominated by the Shia group Hezbollah and the Amal movement, largely because of the fragmentation of the Sunni vote. Some of Hariri's supporters shifted their loyalty after his company, Saudi Auger, laid off many employees, as well as his charities and media outlets in Lebanon, largely because of Saudi spending cuts linked perhaps to what happened last year on that front. Now, some of the loss of support has also been compounded by what some see as Hariri's weak stance on Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah seeks to win enough seats, around 43, in order for it to veto any law that it opposes. Hariri is expected, I'm hearing from some observers and commentators, to be reinstated as Prime Minister. According to some sources that have been trickling through, it's even a done backdoor deal. A governing coalition between Hariri and Hezbollah is likely to stay intact following the vote today. He's considered to be a safe choice because he is somewhat of a unifier, a consensus builder, and even more popular now, actually, after he resigned in Riyadh after what many believe was Saudi duress and then retracted that resignation upon returning to Lebanon. He aroused a lot of sympathy, a lot of nationalism in the country. Now, the aftermath of the vote will be negotiations over the government's formation. That will be crucial. That could take several months. That could even take a year or more. Knowing Lebanon, we don't know how long that could take. Now, in terms of civil society, that big drive, today's election should help really gauge the extent of public support for that movement, especially given as you mentioned, Ramiz, the first time youth vote for those between 21 and 30. But the real work, of course, will begin after polling is now over. The real work will, in fact, now begin. Now, although this movement, the civil movement, has brought these groups together on the basis of their interests, which are very closely aligned, they're still not completely unified, not completely together, and only time will tell if they can, in fact, build on this momentum to drive real policy change that's in the national interest, not just for the sake of various districts. Now, looking wider, of course, no matter the outcome, there are still many variables, as we've heard from Sanam and her guests in Beirut today, outside of the bounds of this election, outside of the bounds of Lebanon, regionally speaking. The rest of the Middle East, as always, will cast a long, foreboding shadow over this tiny, resilient country.
Now, you mentioned the independents. Ramez, you also said that they're not just presenting fresh faces, they actually have a political platform this time around. Tell us more about that.
Well, one of the key points that these groups have been campaigning on has been on the fact that, on paper, Lebanon does have the political institutions necessary to have a proper representational democracy. We just need to reinstate the work and the job of a parliamentary. If you actually look at the last parliament, on average, these MPs spend 27% of their time in their legislative duties. 20% is nothing. On average, these parliamentaries had been in office for 42 years. So we have had this disconnection between the representative bodies and the population. Even if the civil society groups do manage to get 1, 2, or even 3 candidates, they will actually be engaging in the jobs of a parliamentary. So the job of an MP is to propose laws, propose draft laws, initiate debate within the parliament. And this is something that they will stress on. They will constantly mediatize for that people start to realize that they have a possibility to have their voice touched upon and enhanced in parliament.
And as we were hearing from Mariam a little earlier, the dynasty's focus on acting on their respective sects and interests has an impact on everyday life. Tell us more about that.
Well, I mean, when you look at some of the major inefficiencies of the country, you mentioned them earlier, lack of electricity, lack of waste collection system, no water, public congestion. Some of these issues are very easily handled. You actually have multiple reform plans that have been paid by the state to actually give out a proper plan to distribute electricity evenly across the country, to distribute water. The issue today is that the people at the top do not have an interest in actually changing the system, because it usually does cut back on the things that they can then offer and decline to the system that they're engaged in, which then cuts back on their possibility to gain influence. So one of the key questions today is, how can we initiate change? So a lot of these civil society groups have been campaigning for years through NGOs. And today, because of the lack of a state presence, a lot of them have actually been able to move things forward. So the question is, if we manage to start pushing for draft laws within the parliament, people will start debating them and maybe start demanding progressively to have better rights.
Now, as we've been hearing, a record number of first-time hopefuls have campaigned for change during this election, urging voters to shun the country's political dynasties, accusing them of having mismanaged the country for decades. But while the new electoral system allows them to present fresh opposition to the political establishment, these fresh faces are facing a number of obstacles in their fight for parliamentary seats. Laila Malana Allen and Marguerite Silva report.
A last-ditch effort to garner votes ahead of Sunday's election. But a heavy cynicism prevails. Years of political stasis and an entrenched political elite have left few with faith in the political system.
I've lived in Lebanon since I was born, but I've never voted, and I'm not going to vote because I'm not convinced by the candidates.
Despite a change in the law to allow proportional representation, many Lebanese feel a shift away from the political dynasties that have run the country for decades is unlikely. But not everyone is so negative.
I encourage everyone to vote. I'm against 99% of the candidates, but I will vote. This 1% of hope, I'm hoping for this 1% to win.
Since the 2009 election, a new generation has passed the voting age of 21. An estimated 700,000 first-time voters have registered to vote. They now make up 20% of the electorate, and their allegiances are unknown. So candidates both old and new are taking notice of these fresh voices speaking up.
People were afraid to engage in such activities. It's like a domino effect. And now we have a very big bunch of young people who are actually engaged and who are fighting to make the change.
And it's not only young people who believe this election could lead to progress.
The law can bring in new people. All we have now is an inheritance system, this minister giving his seat to his son and so on. But now everyone can choose who they want.
In this election, for the first time, unknown independent candidates will face a lower bar to be elected, and voters will be allowed to select their preferred individual rather than just voting for a group of allied candidates. However, whether they'll give this new breed of politicians a chance or revert to their traditional allegiances remains to be seen.
Now, Ramez, because it's been almost a decade in the making, there's a huge number of new voters coming in with this poll. They're getting their first chance to have their say in these parliamentary elections. Is there a real generational shift? What do you think that turnout tells us?
Well, one of the things I mentioned in the beginning was we're at a generational crossroads. So that today you have a major part of the Lebanese society that has not lived the trauma of the civil war. So for a lot of the Lebanese youth, they do not see the legitimacy of these political players that have been in power since before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and what came after the Civil War. So the question is, how can the youth mobilize to actually bring about change? And so we saw great images of some of the young campaigners on the ground. There's loads of Lebanese that are very well educated, have gone to Europe and the United States, studying in the best universities, working in the biggest positions, that are coming back to Lebanon, taking the bet that what we see in the West, we can implement in our own country. If you want fair institutions, we can actually fight for it. And I think that this momentum has been building upon for the past few years. And I think this election will consolidate this and hopefully lead us to better outcomes in the future.
And Mariam, we heard those words. They don't have the trauma of that civil war. Lebanon's strongest political party is also the only one with an active militia. That's Hezbollah. It's often presented by its detractors as an Iranian proxy. Is that all it is?
Well, Hezbollah is a major political and military force in Lebanon. It was formed in 1982 in response to Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon and managed to actually successfully push back that occupying force. And now its popularity among the Lebanese Shia population in particular comes from, in part, the security and also the social services and development programs that it has set up, for instance, following Israel's bombardment of southern Lebanon in the summer of 2006. Hezbollah, with Iranian support, rebuilt everything in the south, from mending every house, the mosques, the streets, to mending damaged cemeteries, to offering financial support. Afterwards, the South re-emerged with more solid infrastructure than ever before, than more than even the Lebanese government could have, in fact, offered. Now, in terms of military might, Hezbollah is considered stronger by some than the Lebanese army. It sent thousands of fighters to Syria to shore up President Bashar al-Assad and cleared vast region along the country's shared border of Islamic militants pushing back terrorists who had infiltrated the northern city of Asal alongside Lebanese armed forces, leaving hundreds of its fighters killed and wounded. Now it's on those military gains that it has heavily campaigned this time round. On the other end, of course, there are critics in Lebanon who are very wary of the power of Hezbollah, who see it as something of a rogue state within a state. Also, the regional and historic divide between the Shias and the Sunnis is another source of tension. There are Sunnis in Lebanon in particular who are apprehensive because they feel that they don't have a protector, like, for example, the historic Christian militias like Hezbollah for the Shia, so that's problematic for them. However, it's also worth noting that this time round, according to the Middle East Carnegie Center, divisive issues like Hezbollah's weapons and its role in regional conflicts have been almost entirely absent from the electoral campaigns, and that indicates an implicit acceptance of the party's domestic hegemony. So.
Let's go back to Beirut now. And Sana Rachente, this time you're joined by investigative journalist and civil society activist Habib Bata.
Indeed, I am. Thank you very much, Nadia. Welcome back to Beirut. Habib, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. There are a number of you that we can say have been pushing for what we're referring to as emerging actors, outside players. But beyond the fact that they seem to be riding this wave of discontent here in Lebanon, what do they really have to offer that the traditional political players haven't been able to?
I think they have everything to offer, actually, because the traditional players have not provided any solution to the country's problems. We've seen the problems multiply over the past several decades they've been in power. We're living in an environmental disaster in Lebanon today, public services disaster, refugee crisis disaster. So anything offered is more than what's been offered today by the independents. The independents are actually putting forward platforms talking about issues, whereas the traditional parties are talking about themselves as a personality cult, themselves as a savior of the country with very vague language. The independents are going very specific, and they're actually talking about the issues by actually going to the issues. So while
they talk about the issues, but I mean, maximum, most likely 4 people will get voted in. Can they actually make a difference?
Well, I think it's not just about the results today. I mean, I definitely think that, the odds are stacked against them. The parties that they're competing with have millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, and they've been doing this for a while. It's not their first rodeo. These guys have been doing this for decades and decades. They have institutions, they have hospitals, they have schools, they have patronage, they have stuff they can give out. They have tangible benefits. That's the real challenge for independence, is what can they give out to these people? They don't have that kind of resources to provide people with favors and services that they need. So it's hard also to blame people for voting for these parties, because they actually do get something in return for them. However, the parties have failed in large part. The independents are, addressing issues and bringing to the table issues that are not mentioned in the election, such as the garbage crisis, such as public access to space in the city.
You're talking a lot about the domestic issues. What about more external issues, the refugee crisis, something that's really impacted Lebanon more so than other countries in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there isn't a magic bullet for these problems. We can't expect some candidates to come and solve them.
You're letting them off the hook there.
Well, I'm not. These are very difficult problems the country faces, and geopolitics, Lebanon really can't control that to a huge extent. It's a very small country with a very small military, so I think that, but there are things that can be done in the country. If we can't, create world peace, at least we can have roads to drive on. At least we can feel safe in our homes. At least we can not breathe toxic waste. So there's a lot of issues that are happening beyond geopolitics. Lebanon's story is always
So that seems like a priority that should be on the agenda.
Well, I mean, if the air we breathe is not clean, if the food that we eat is not clean, then I don't know how we can even be talking about international issues if we can't even provide the basic modicum of public services and safety for the citizens of this country. So it's kind of funny sometimes that we're talking about geopolitics when people don't even stop at traffic lights, and more people are killed in Lebanon's streets than in Lebanon's wars.
You're talking about all these domestic challenges at the moment. I want to ask you something about the electoral process itself. Were you yourself personally disappointed that some of these so-called independent players in a way had to align themselves with more traditional political candidates to be able to emerge as somewhat stronger?
I mean, I think that, that is a natural outcome in some sense because we're living in a war environment, where these parties have been the dominant force for decades. The people who ran the war are still running the country today. So in some ways, we can't just think that that war is over and ended. I mean, those institutions are still a big part of politics.
One analyst told me earlier today this is them selling out in a way.
Well, yeah, I think if you're allying with the parties, you're not really independent. So there are a lot of choices still that are still independent, but things are going to be blurry. There isn't this, separation between power in a country that happens over a very quick period. You're going to have some vestiges of power and relationships that are going to be happening. But I think the independent candidates have already changed things because they've introduced a new political culture to the country we didn't have. We have a culture now of talking about the issues. We have a culture now of raising issues and being heard that are issues that the government doesn't want to talk about. And so the government really can't hide issues the way it is. So the candidates have used their election platforms to communicate to the public, to raise issues to the public, to question the authority with all that they're doing, whether it's the garbage crisis, whether it's the loans that they're taking out from international institutions that are probably going to make us go into further debt. They're able to use their platform and their media to speak their message. And there's so much more media today. So really political power is tied to media power. And now we have so many different media outlets that political elites can't rely on their media to be the sole message anymore. So the weakening of the media power also means a weakening of the political power. These are long-term things. I think that what's happening today is people are laying the groundwork for this political culture. The work done by independents is very impressive. They've put together national lists for the first time. They've done a huge amount of organizing to do that.
Which were vaguely disorganized from what I'm hearing, the lists themselves.
Well, I mean, of course, I don't think it was perfect, but just to have a national list, just to have one, that is a new thing in Lebanon. Having a really solid opposition, an organized opposition, that's very new, and it's still growing. I mean, they couldn't run all the seats, but they did do a big portion. They also, and these independent groups, they group together different groups from different parts of the country, so they're kind of like an alliance and not really one party. So that's a real feat to organize in politics. I think that independents are learning what politics means. It means decades of organizing and putting things together. We've been like 1 decade now. We've seen the independent show in municipal elections. We've seen them show in union elections, and now we're seeing them show in parliamentary elections. So with every election, there is more organization and more momentum and more excitement. So what they provide actually is an entrance to Lebanese politics that is not in the party system. They're actually creating a politics outside the party system in Lebanon. That's very new. So people that are getting excited, people have something to do in Lebanese politics for the first time. I see people excited for the first time about Lebanese politics, and that is a feat on its own.
Habib Battah, a very optimistic investigative journalist. Thank you very much for joining us here on the France 24 special. And Nadia, I want to talk to you about some of the challenges that these so-called independent candidates, they're referred to as external candidates, they're actually some of them part of the civil society movement, the challenges that they're faced, because I've been meeting a number of these candidates over the past 2 days, some of them saying that they didn't have the funding for their election campaigns. It costs thousands of dollars just to be able to register to run in the election process here in Lebanon. In addition to that, as I mentioned earlier in that conversation with our guest Habib Battah, who's an investigative journalist, the list of the independent candidates were largely confusing for the voters. They were allying themselves with some bigger political players, so voters were confused as to which way they should go, certainly when it came to the preferred versus the actual list of candidates that they had to vote for. In addition to that, it feels like this is an immensely long road for this so-called civil society movement. The country still has a long way to go. But as we heard from our guest just now, this is just the beginning of what could be a better political climate for Lebanon. Back to you.
Anam, thank you very much for that. Ramez, I was seeing you nod very vigorously there when we were hearing her guest telling her that actually, yes, local issues right now are more important than regional considerations.
I mean, we have to be pragmatic here. The big word that we have to emphasize on is momentum. Today, we have the momentum to start to have a base. We're building political culture, as was perfectly said earlier. So in order to do this, we have to focus on local issues. We have to focus on everyday issues that people are confronted on. The bigger questions, be it the weapons of Hezbollah, be it the refugee crisis, be it an alignment between Iran and Saudi Arabia, are, to be very honest, beyond our power, beyond the power of these citizens. Lebanon has been the cornerstone of Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades. It's not a bunch of grassroots movements that are going to change it. But what these grassroots movements can change is giving public services to its citizens, giving the opportunity for people to have their voices heard on. And I think this is the main point that we're emphasizing. And I think if we do get a few candidates in Parliament this year who will start to do this, it is a major victory.
And when the bigger picture comes into the local issue, we're hearing about people getting their voices heard. One of the issues that wasn't addressed much during the campaign is the status of the 200,000 Palestinian refugees who are living in Lebanon. Tell us about their situation, Mary.
Well, Palestinians are neither allowed to hold office or to vote. Of course, they also can't inherit property, are excluded from a number of professions, public education and healthcare. Many live in squalid conditions, in camps, living in this constant state of transit. Now, there are no Palestinian seats in Parliament, but a mock campaign went viral in the run-up to this election for lobbying for the civil rights of Palestinians in Lebanon. In a poster that was widely publicized on social media and around the country as well, Palestinian Lebanese activist Man al-Khattam launched her campaign for the ghost, we could say, Palestinian seat of the 3rd district under the platform Mawjoudeen, which means in Arabic, we exist. We are here. Of course, many Palestinians don't want formal recognition in Lebanon because they are holding out for their right to return to Palestine. But what they are fighting for is their civil rights.
And there is a wider civil rights issue, and that's women's representation. Now, for the first time with this election, women made up 10% of candidates. That's up from 1.7% in 2009. Then only 4 women made it into the 128-seat parliament. Let's take a look at this first small step towards equal representation.
The Lebanese parliament has not changed for 9 years. Out of the 128 seats, only 4 are held by women. Yet the number of female candidates has never been as high as in this year's parliamentary election. 111 women in total have submitted their candidacy. Jumana Haddad, journalist and writer, is running as an independent. She's known for her support of women and defence of freedom of expression.
Independent candidates, especially women, have limited funds. Women hear at a very young age that only men are involved in politics. I'm running to show that it's time for women in independence to also have a voice in parliament.
Other women have chosen to be candidates for parties. Rula Tabsharudi is running for the political faction Future Movement in Beirut. As a lawyer with experience in legislation, she has worked with parliamentary committees to amend and formulate a number of laws.
During my career, I have worked on developing our laws, especially ones regarding women. It's not normal that a parliament full of men is debating laws that concern women.
Only 12 women ran in Lebanon's last parliamentary elections held in 2009. In 2018, the number of female candidates has risen to more than 11% of the total number of candidates. Voters appear open to a more egalitarian political system.
Women are more than half of society. They're the whole society.
Women are equal to men and they should succeed in politics.
Yet today, in Lebanon, the majority of women working in politics inherited their position from their fathers or their husbands.
So, Mariam, for all its modernity, women hardly have any political representation in Lebanon. They also can't hand down citizenship. Only men have that prerogative. Are women getting organised to change this state of affairs?
Well, I mean, this time round, as we've been discussing, record number of female candidates, although it's worth mentioning that in the electoral law reform, there was no quota for women, which perhaps should have been set to ensure equal representation and opportunity. Is this a turning point for women's rights? There's a long way to go, but as you mentioned, Ramiz, momentum. Let's keep building that momentum. Yes, women have less rights than men when it comes to many, many things. Child custody, divorce, inheritance, and citizenship. Women are still unable to pass on their nationality to their children if they marry a non-Lebanese. Now, in March, the Foreign Minister Gibran Bassil proposed an amendment to the country's nationality law that would give women, Lebanese women married to foreign men, the right to transfer their nationality to their children. Lebanon is one of 26 countries in the world that do not give women equal rights to men when it comes to passing on their nationality to their children. But, and a big but, activists were up in arms over a significant exception in this proposal. The right would not extend to Lebanese women married to citizens of neighbouring countries, meaning Syrians or Palestinians. In fact, the foreign minister said he would even remove the right of Lebanese men to give their citizenship to their Syrian or Palestinian wives and children of those marriages so deeply rooted racism there, and not too deeply buried beneath what Mr. Basile calls an existential threat to the country. So still a long way to go on the women's rights front, but yes, there are many voices crying out for leaps and bounds in that arena.
Well, let's cross back to Beirut on this. Sanam Chantier, you've been watching men and women go and cast their ballot. Does that lack of female representation perhaps have something to do with the low turnout we've seen also today?
Nadia, I have to echo what we just heard in the studio there from our colleague Mariam Saab. There were high record number of women running in these elections, 86 compared to just 12 in the previous elections in 2009. And that's actually brought about some level of excitement. Speaking to some women candidates, they've been saying that they've had very positive reactions from people. They want to see more women. And in fact, a number of voters that I spoke to today said to me they came to the ballot boxes exactly for that reason. They want to have a female voice in them. And although it's unlikely that high numbers will get voted in, even if several of them manage to enter parliament, that can start. That can, again, we're looking at women, we're looking at that civil society movement as just the beginning for the politics climate here in Lebanon. And what's particularly interesting is that, historically speaking, as with other regions in the country, parliament has been dominated by men, but actually in Lebanon, it's one of the worst countries in the area. So this is something that there have been pledges to make a difference to, though, as Mariam mentioned earlier, it's still a very long way to go.
And thank you very much for that. Ramez, how has the groups you've been supporting been addressing this particular issue?
I mean, if you look at the candidates that have been fielded for these lists, equal representation, perfect parity between women and men and women. They've been talking about decriminalizing violence against women, about having quotas in store in parliament to have 50 representation. And they are talking about loads of social issues that are meant to empower the role of women in society, in the workforce, in terms of maternity leaves. And these are all questions that are easily disregarded in Lebanese politics because of certain patriarchal considerations that we have been seeing. We have certain parties that have not even fielded one female candidate in these elections. So today, women are more educated, are present in the workforce in Lebanon, and are slowly getting their voices heard because of the alternative channels from which they can talk about. And one of the best examples is in the Tripoli district, where you have a list that is made entirely of women that is participating in the elections today. And I think that's a massive development and very positive one for the future.
It's clearly a bit of a culture clash, and you're saying this to me here in Paris, not in Lebanon. And the other first during this poll, Mariam, was the Lebanese diaspora voting for the first time in their country of residence. Now, while just over half of the 83,000 voters who were registered to vote did actually take place, the diaspora is a force to be reckoned with.
Yes, turnout, Nadia, was low, we could say at 59%, perhaps because you had to register online to do so, and then your application had to be approved by the Ministry of Interior and municipalities, and the process wasn't as straightforward as just turning up and ticking a few boxes. Australia had the largest number of registered voters, followed by Canada and the United States. This was an important moment for Lebanese diaspora. For me, growing up among the Lebanese Australian community, I always felt that being far away from the ancestral home made many Lebanese more determined to reconnect, to stay linked in with their mother tongue, with their culture, with the political situation back home. And there are more Lebanese living outside of Lebanon than in it. The diaspora population is estimated to be as high potentially as 14 million. That's compared to some 4 million people living inside of Lebanon. Of course, that speaks volumes about how difficult life is to maintain inside of Lebanon, which is why so many people are forced to leave. Now, the Lebanese Foreign Ministry has been actively trying to engage the diaspora population. Foreign Minister Gibran Basile has been traveling the world as part of the Lebanese Diaspora Energy Project. He was here in Paris just a few months ago, and I spoke to him at the Sydney event, and he said that it's part of a big push to promote collaboration in healthcare, arts, education, to push for trade, investment opportunities. Now, on the topic of the elections, he said that the involvement of the diaspora is in Lebanese political life is vital to shaping the future of the country. Of course, he hopes, as many do, that the Lebanese who are forced to leave the country will return. There's been a big push for those to outside of the country to reclaim their citizenship and to move back, of course, in order for that to happen, many changes need to be made. Ramiz is one of those who's Lebanese in Paris. Do you think you'll be heading back anytime soon? What would it take to get you back to Lebanon?
Well, I think I would be willing to take the bet that loads of young Lebanese are taking today, is to actually go back, see what's happening in Europe and in the West, and try to build something in the country. And I think today we're seeing that more and more. We are having the institutions, we are having the groundwork, the platforms that are present to try and build something for the future. And I think this is just the beginning of something much more vital for the future.
And are you studying with the hopes of returning there to work immediately, or is that sort of a long-term plan? Are you going to maybe get more involved in politics? I mean, you're in the political science school here in Paris.
I think I'd like to take the opportunity to continue traveling, seeing how things are done. I had the opportunity to go to Asia for a while, see how they engage with politics there, how do they include civil society and build on social issues, and then hopefully to take all of these lessons back to Lebanon.
Okay, well, as we've said, this has been a very complex poll in a complex nation, in a complex region. Let me ask you both, if you could try to sum the whole, what's at stake in this election in perhaps a word or a sentence. Shall I start with you, Ramiz?
Of course. As with Lebanon, any small consequence or action happening in the country will have massive repercussions anywhere else. So Lebanon is a cornerstone, it's a window into the Middle East and a window into the understanding of the complexity of the Middle East. This election will not have groundbreaking revolutionary outcome, but it will start to show that with good engagement, by utilizing the youth, by utilizing social media, we can start to build civil society awareness and rebuild politics and take back politics from these elites that have been confiscating it for too long.
In just 2 words, maybe, Miriam?
Well, I think this election proves that if a cat has 9 lives, then Lebanon is well past its 10th. That's just a testament to the country's unparalleled resistance.
Thank you very much, Mariam Saab, Ramiz Abid, and thank you, of course, to our correspondent in Beirut, Sanam Chantier there, and all her guests. That's where we're leaving this special edition on the Lebanese elections. Thank you for watching. Coming up next on France 24, Rochelle Harrison-Pless will be bringing you a news update in just a few minutes. Stay with us.